peut-être épuisé et on veut aller à la maison pour le week-end. Ah, j'ai usé un anglicisme. Pour moi, ma présentation, ça veut dire que le contenu de ma présentation est une affaire de déjà vu. Entre autres, c'est un emprunt de français en anglais. Mais on dit ça déjà vu. Alors pour moi, plutôt c'est le cas de déjà entendu. Alors spécifiquement, c'est les lectures le mercredi et aussi aujourd'hui. Alors j'ai le choix de faire une présentation très brève ou d'utiliser ma présentation un peu plus longue, pas très longue, pour accentuer quelques points donnés et déjà faits. Mais aussi de parler d'une autre question, et c'est la question de la norme du standard de la langue mondiale, de l'anglais comme monde idéal. Ma présentation sera en anglais, mais mes diapositives sont en français. Je veux vous montrer quelque chose et après ma présentation, je vous demande pourquoi est-ce que j'ai montré cette clip de YouTube. J'espère qu'il y a le son.
I'm the lyrical gangster. Big up the crew in the area. Still love you like that. No, we don't die. Yes, we multiply. Anyone press me here, the fire they sing. Act like you know we go. I know what both don't know. Touch them up and go. Here come the upstairs.
C'est simplement vous êtes épuisé, hein? C'est pour activer. Mais il y a une raison académique. Alors, on va revenir à ça.
Vous envoyez encore des vidéos?
No, okay, so I'd like to speak about English as a world language. It is my fourth language, so I hope you excuse that I will speak, and I will use it very much as a lingua franca. But I want to bring up a few points about English, and very much the issue about which norms and which variety. Because one of the things that we have heard earlier in this colloquium is actually about the French opportunity or the possibility of using three words for referring to issues around language, which English simply does through the word language. Langue, langage, parole. So you try to make differences. The other thing, however, you will have noticed, those of you who work in English, is a much greater use, and unfortunately dictionaries still haven't caught on, or spelling programs, is that the word that is used much more now is Englishes. So the word English is actually pluralized. And what I would like to focus on is very much about the issue of when you learn English, or when English medium instruction occurs, what is actually the variety that needs to be learned or that students want to learn. The first few slides I'm going to go over very, very quickly because quite frankly, this is what others have already talked about. We have heard over and over again, why is English a lingua franca? Where is it dominant? The ones where I've put a question mark are those that perhaps are not 100%, especially in diplomacy. French is still seen as one of the major languages of diplomacy, and of course, the topic of our conversation or our colloquium over the last 3 or 4 days is really, is English the lingua franca in higher education? Okay. I'm not going to click on any of these links. They're there for you. What you can see is in the last, I would say, 10 years, the immense amount of literature that has been created, not so much on the learning of English, but really looking at the different roles and the different varieties of English. In fact, not so much the French, but certainly German scholars have been at the forefront of looking into varieties and origins of the different varieties of English. But so what Gilles Ferlot actually talked about, I've left in English. So basically, although it's not the only context within which the varieties of English are being studied, a still very dominant paradigm is that of Brash-Kashrou, of inner circle, outer circle, and expanding circle Englishes. I think most of you are familiar with it, but to put it very, very simplistically, inner circle are those countries, communities in which English is seen as a first language, as a mother tongue. Outer circle are usually those countries that had been colonized by mainly Britain, but to some extent also America, and that therefore in which English has a formal role, and then the expanding circle, which is basically the rest of the world. That might be probably the largest area would be China, but of course most of Europe is also involved in that. What we see is an enormous variety in research. Actually, at this very moment in Istanbul, there is the World Congress of World Englishes. So I'm very pleased to be here rather than there, to have different kinds of perspectives. Again, these ones, again, I'm not going to go through the various links, but it basically is, there is also a phenomenal amount, and we've heard that in the last 2 or 3 days too, about English medium instruction. And obviously we're dealing with that at a number of levels. Similarly to the colloquium here, there is the practice, there are the mechanics. How do you do it? What is it that you do in the classroom? What does it mean? Right through the sociological, the psychological, but also very much the political elements. And these things have been brought together. What I can show you is, I'm not going to do this, but the number of theses, the theses that are being produced at the moment on looking at English medium instruction is phenomenal. So I think every second student who's doing something on English pedagogy is trying to write something about English medium instruction. I think it's a very good idea, but still. Okay, again, I'm not going to go into detail about that. We've heard a lot about this. Why is it that English medium instruction is becoming more and more important and actually is accelerating extremely fast? Is whether it's true or not, but basically the arguments brought forward, we've heard very eloquently from previous speakers. International competition in especially scientific research. One of the things, the 2 things I just briefly want to point out, one is, I think more and more non-Anglophone European countries are going to be faced with what is called research assessment exercises to show that the public money that they put into universities lead to excellent research that is quoted worldwide. A very, very negative thing about that at the moment in Anglophone societies, especially the UK, but also Australia, New Zealand, and in fact Hong Kong, which also has such an exercise, is that writing in a language other than English is often discounted, which is a phenomenal problem for scholars in Anglophone countries who work on other languages. So if you're a Romance scholar who publishes 90% in French journals, your outcome in the research assessment exercise might be very low, which means you may be declared non-research active. So you can see the problems that you can see. The second thing, and I think Julie and others have been alerting to that, is the terror, I would say, of university rankings, which of course are largely based, although the world at the moment, the ranking that is seen to be the strongest is actually a Chinese ranking, the Jiaotong ranking, Shanghai Jiaotong ranking. But the kinds of elements that you put into the ranking are so skewed, not only skewed towards an Anglophone world, but actually skewed completely towards the sciences. By the way, if we're all working probably in the humanities, try and attract a Nobel Prize winner in literature and your university's ranking will skyrocket. One Nobel Prize winner and you can jump about 100 places, okay? Because that's actually one of the criteria. It certainly is also true that what you are hearing, both as a kind of rhetoric by a variety of universities around the world, that English is part of a global education. English, okay? I think what is being underestimated to some extent in a conference like this is that what I will, in French, which they've also tried to incorporate into English, was that if you knew where the power was, there was this rather stereotypical expression, chercher la femme. Well, I think in today's world is où est la monnaie, or où sont les finances? The whole thing is a lot of what is happening is about issues around capital and about making money. It is phenomenal, and you will see in my actual research project that one of the major reasons for students from non-European countries to arrive in what is called continental Europe is a monetary aspect, because it is becoming impossible to finance more than one student in a family to either go to United Kingdom or to the United States. Again, what I'm basically repeating here is what you've already heard, is in kind of what's been the distribution, and it is true that it actually started more the northwest of Europe, moving towards the east, and then also and the south. And that was very much echoed by the various statistics you saw about the number of programs that are available in the various countries. Now, I think it's actually sciences dures and not sciences naturelles, so my apologies for that, although I am using français comme à l'étranger. So what you basically have here is that the kind of movement is also being from the natural sciences to the social sciences, and increasingly, in fact, the humanities and philosophical sciences. Certainly it is, the focus still is very much on the master degree, but especially in many countries now the doctoral degree, and we are starting to see some development in terms of undergraduate degrees, although that is still relatively resisted, especially in the area I will be talking about, the humanities. As you've also heard from major speakers, there is a lot of ambivalence and controversy around the kind of reactions to teaching through the medium of English. There's a substantial difference between the disciplines. probably, and rightly so. I mean, I'm not taking a position here, or I will declare a position. It really is that not that long ago, I think it was in the 1990s, that there was actually a suggestion then in the Netherlands. This was already in the early 1990s, to completely anglicize higher education. In fact, it was an interjection of a particular body that normally doesn't have that much power, is the so-called Dutch Language Union, which is the way in which the Netherlands and the Flemish work together in protection of their language, really did stand up and said, if you are going to make English the language of higher education, you will reduce Dutch to a dialect, and it will become a diglossic situation. Other kinds of work I'm doing with the Dutch language outside of the Netherlands or Belgium shows that that is absolutely the case, because Dutch people, when they move to another country, move more or less, they drop their language within their own generation. They don't even wait until the next generation. There is also a substantial, and I think we've heard that through the talk this morning on the court case, is different departments will have different views, and then of course individuals. I will be focusing more on individuals. What we heard especially yesterday, especially from the French side, is the end of one's national language. If there is no longer higher education in which you are supposed to bring forward the ideas, if that can no longer be undertaken, or is no longer undertaken in your language, then actually you are reducing it to a form of dialect. We've also heard very strong arguments about how can you express yourself as well as possible in a language that really isn't your major language. I say major language rather than mother tongue, because to give my own interpretation is, English is my fourth language, but it is my academic language. So most of my ideas I can express much better in English than in the languages with which I'm most familiar on a day-to-day basis. But so there are these issues about how well can you express ideas. The other thing that unfortunately has happened, it is starting to change, but in many countries, again I want to refer originally, because the Netherlands has been sort of spearheading this, is that they started introducing a master studies in Dutch language philology, which had to be taught through the medium of English by the people who were specialists in English, in Dutch, and they were given 3 months to get themselves ready. Okay, so you do have these kinds of weird actions, and then of course something that as a dean I was often faced with is actually you are creating for the individuals an enormous amount of workload, because there is still a whole issue about rethinking the kinds of materials that you use. So these are the sorts of arguments that you've heard before. Now, I'm going to show you a small pilot study. The way I work is I'm much more a social scientist than a humanities scholar. So what I'd like to do is to do a small pilot study, which is basically qualitative, and then to see if I've got enough to bring over a fairly large one. But so again, the background is that the introduction of English medium instruction in the countries that I've done the study in, which is largely Northern Europe, so it does not involve, you'll see it was Austria, Germany, the Benelux, and the Scandinavian countries, where in fact the mixture of, these are master's courses, the mixture of students in the class were sort of like 30% international students or 50% international students, 60% international students. So it wasn't that most of the class were local students with about 2% of international students. So in lots of ways, these kinds of contexts were very much lingua franca. That is, the prevalence of non-native speakers. I don't like that term, but anyway, I'll use it, and that's why I've put it between scare quotes, is the non-native speakers, both amongst the professors or the teaching staff and the students. The professors or the teaching staff had very, very diverse linguistic backgrounds. I'll come back to that. What I was specifically interested in is, depending on the kind of discipline that they had and also where they came from, how had they acquired proficiency in English, what other exposure did they have to English, and also very much what sort of method had they had to learn English, and the similar kinds of questions with regard to the students. With regard to the students, there was a greater focus on to what extent was there a substantial number of students who came from a non-European country as such. In effect, what you will see is, and I've used that, the kinds of varieties of English that were brought into the classroom was, number one, an absolute, I can't say it too much, absolute minority of L1 speakers. So your native speakers were almost non-present. We are talking here about master's courses. Of course, there's a large contingent of American students who go on the year abroad, who come and spend time in European countries. They certainly make up a large group, but not of master's courses. So in this case, the majority of people were people who could be described as having English as a second language, as a third language. In some cases, they had learned it in a so-called inner circle English-speaking country, like the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and to some extent South Africa. But there were also quite a number of people from Singapore, from India, from particular African countries that had been colonized by the Brits, and indeed also Japanese Koreans that belong to the overall group of expanding circles. So the interest that I had, and this is a more political, socio-political interest than actually the practicalities of the classroom. You have heard over the last couple of days quite a bit about, especially through the talk given by Gilles Forlot, about linguistic imperialism, linguicide, and so on. So there certainly is a very strong movement amongst English language scholars who may or may not be English dominant, about what exactly English in its role as an imperialist language has achieved or shouldn't achieve. Okay, so there is very much a movement which we haven't talked that much about, is the recognition of English as a lingua franca, as a genuine variety of English. That is especially the work of Zeidelhofer, Andy Kirkpatrick, and a few others, and Jennifer Jenkins in Britain, are genuinely interested in describing the variety of English that is called an English as a lingua franca as a genuine separate variety of English. And there is a movement amongst that group, it's very controversial, but amongst that group, to promote that form of English as the basis for English medium instruction. Because it, in a way, according to them, and I don't express an opinion, but according to them, it neutralizes much more questions of power, because it is an English language, it uses a variety of constructions that are typical of an English language, but it is not one of the two most dominant prestige varieties amongst English, American English and British English. So that's the kind of work that is being done. At the moment, most of that work is corpus-based. So Andy Kirkpatrick, who works in an Asian context, has created a large corpus of how people speak English in Asian countries to point out what could potentially become an Asian norm of speaking English. Zeidelhofer and Jenkins worked largely on a European one. Okay, so, but very few has been tested about how to implement something like that. So what I'm interested in is much more from a perspective of a sociolinguistic perspective, is how do both teachers and students feel about what goes on in the EMI classroom. So I'm not concerned here with the quality of what goes on. It is about the opinions of what students feel they do or should do or can do, and also about the teachers. So I'm going into those discussions now. I am focusing very much on the disciplines within humanities. I am somewhat overstating the case, but it is true that the linguistic and the communicative element in humanities courses are much more central to debates than they are in some of the exact or into the natural sciences. I'm trying to minimize overstating this because it is not that simplistic. But you can have a more limited vocabulary within English to discuss matters of scientific importance, provided you stay within a narrow field. That is much more difficult within the humanities. Also, the kinds of assessment procedures that are undertaken within humanities are 90% completely language focused. It is not, with the exception actually of theoretical linguistics or descriptive linguistics, where you get a range of words and you've got to work out which language is it or what kind of morphology. Quite frankly, it is always very large treatises, either verbally or written. So my focus here is on, it was a pilot study on looking at students who were undertaking master's courses in humanities. Okay, so what I'm basically looking at is awareness, on the one hand, awareness that they are working in a lingua franca context, the attitudes they have towards the way in which the teacher speaks English, and also how the teachers feel what's happening with the students, and also the practices they have in the classroom. Okay, so I've done this entirely online. So I used some of my contacts in the various countries and said, could you basically talk about that in class, and they can email me. So I have never met any of these students. I've not talked with them. It is a pilot study, but this is the way in which online research can help you do things fairly quickly. So the universities are from Scandinavia, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Germany, and also Austria. Okay, so in terms of the students that responded, and I thought the response was actually quite high. So there were 80 students from 25 different countries that were studying in the 8 different countries, and they were in 18 different universities. The way they had to identify, I did not ask about nationality, but I asked them whether they considered themselves local students, irrespective of their language background, or some were local students, or whether they thought themselves as international students. With international students, I did ask whether they were from another European country or not. So here you've got the breakdown. Okay, so what I found was I asked them questions about how they had learned English, and almost all of the students who said they were local to the country in which they studied had studied English at school, with occasional visits to an English-speaking country, and that, in the case of Europe, was largely the UK. Very few had gone anywhere else. International students, 22 of them had come from other EU countries, largely under Erasmus Mundus, also Erasmus Plus programs. They came from all over Europe, and then about 26 of them came from non-European countries, largely China and Korea, and there were also quite a few students from Russia. What they were enrolled in were masters, largely social political sciences, history, and then communication media studies. When we look at the professors came out of the same countries, 60 responded to me. I excluded my contacts. I did not want them to be included, so I asked them to ask. In this case, from 13 universities, 41 indicated that they considered themselves local, 19 were seen to be international. The profile of the linguistic profile of the local teachers were in lots of ways very similar to the students. They had largely learned their English at school, but also many had studied in an English-speaking country. I would say the majority in the United States and some in Great Britain. And often they already had experience teaching as a tutor or a research assistant to a prof when they were studying in either United States. So in effect, they were almost self-selecting in terms of using English as a medium. All of them published in English. Okay. The international professors, most of them came from other, actually it's not right, about 11 came from other European countries, and most others were actually Americans. The linguistic profile of the other European professors were basically the same as the local ones. Okay. All right, so here the question I asked was, why did you choose to do a course that was taught through English medium? Okay. Well, of course, you always have the students, well, that was the only opportunity that I had. So there were quite a few that said, well, we don't have, especially in the Scandinavian countries. They said, if we wanted to do that, especially international relations, you have to do it through English. So there was no choice. Okay. However, the more integrative motivation that came forward quite often was that they actually wanted to be engaged with students from other countries. Very clearly here, not English-speaking students, but interacting with students from around the globe. That was a very strong motivation. And then you did have those that said, well, you know, that's the in thing, you do it now, so that's true. But I would say the strongest element was really number 2. So they had chosen it to become part in a local environment with an international cohort. The other EU students really reacted in many ways like the local students, okay? However, and I've now pointed towards that, is the non-EU students, one of the major reasons was, I mean, this is a very small scale study, but what was stood out was every single one of them said that it was either for reasons of a visa, it was easier to get into what you still consider to be getting difficult into Germany or Austria. Well, at the moment, Germany is quite a different case, and the finances. Quite a few of them said they had applied 3-4 times to universities in the States and in Britain. In some cases they had been accepted, but then they looked at the fees, the exorbitant fees, and because if they were not number 1 in their family to study overseas, the family had no means of paying for that. So that was one of the major reasons. Another one was where they were not so keen to say, but they said, well, actually, it was good it was in English because, you know, learning Swedish or so would have been difficult. And actually, what is still very important is they had friends who had done it who had basically said it was quite good. Okay. Now, the second question I asked was really about what do you think, okay, what do you think about the linguistic proficiencies of your teacher? And I've left those even on the French slide, okay. So the international students, the students who actually came from outside of Europe, had an overall very positive evaluation of their teachers. And as you can see, I won't read them, there is some they felt sounded like American. Yeah, they thought there were some difficulties, but quite frankly, they were overall quite pleased with what was going on. Remember, we are talking mainly about Northern Europe, and you also know if you look at the Eurobarometer, how widespread English is there. So overall speaking, by the way, the numbers there are like the K indications, so S is for Sweden and L is for the Netherlands, and so on. Okay. The other EU students, so not the local students, were actually overall speaking also relatively positive about the way in which their teachers interacted. Okay, so you do hear quite a few that said, you know, accents and intonation sound not very native, but we understand it. So there was a lot of tolerance. We are talking here about graduate students. They're not undergraduate students, so I think they've had that kind of maturity. Okay. However, the local students were not so impressed with, and I think that's a normal thing with what happens. So I think, you know, 2 or 3, the first 2, of course, I mean, I had, you know, literally 20, 30 examples, but I find it awkward to speak English as a Dane to another Dane, and his English is so Danish. Or she makes a lot of grammatical mistakes. It's embarrassing to the Germans in the class. I think, I'm not sure if the others notice it. So you get that. So there is this element that if you actually have a class in which most of your students are actually speaking the same language, they're more critical about what they see. Okay. What was very important for me was then also this whole issue about English as a lingua franca. And what sort of elements did they think was important for what happened in the classroom? Okay, so they make a major distinction between what can be tolerated in oral communication and the way in which you write. Okay, they also make a distinction between what they expect of teachers and what they expect of themselves or of their fellow students. So in effect, despite quite a bit of tolerance, and you'll see a bit more about varieties of English being used in the classroom, they do want their teachers to either speak American English or British English or stay with those 2 norms. Okay, there was very little variation in the 3 groups of students. Okay. So here they were talking about, well, what is it that you expect? What sort of standard of English can you have in the spoken interaction? Okay, and you can see here that there is substantial tolerance. Of course, we are talking about a European context, so the typical varieties that they're talking about is either American English or British English, far less New Zealand English, Australian English, even Canadian English, actually quite a few. The interesting thing, of course, is I have a preference for American English because it's easier to understand, but I can cope with other accents, just not English or Jamaican or something like that. Now, I'll come back to that, okay? So, when it comes to writing, they have a very narrow view of what can be accepted. And it basically is inner circle English, either American or UK English, or most of them said correct English, whatever that meant. Interestingly, you'll see my final point there is that they expect that what goes on in written work is very much along American or English lines. However, they don't wish to be in any way penalized for making mistakes. Okay, when I asked them about what they knew about English as a lingua franca. Now, I did not use the words lingua franca. I was talking about different kinds of Englishes coming together, and or international English. Their understanding was, I will not say 0, but just above 0. Quite frankly, what they did talk about is, and I just repeat that again, there was substantial tolerance of different accents and of different conventions of writing and even of different words, but only linked to what are inner circle Englishes. So they will give me examples like footpath or pedestrian way, or these things. When I came up with some examples from Singapore English or from South African English, they said that was unacceptable. It's largely because they don't know that, okay? The interesting thing, and I want to finish on that with the students, I just have a very few things about the teachers, is quite frankly, and this is the complexity that we are dealing with in terms of cost benefit. These are students, even if they don't pay £15,000 or 25,000 US dollars, but they do pay somewhat in Europe, okay? For them, tolerance of different accents, of different ways of speaking English is quite high. But in terms of what they want the lecturers to do is to have the two varieties which carry linguistic capital. To put it very bluntly, I'm only paying because I want to have a variety of English that will give me linguistic capital. Singapore English, Nigerian English gives me no linguistic capital in the world. I do not agree with that, but that's what is coming out of the students. And by the way, that is as strong from a Nigerian English speaker as it is from a German English speaker. Okay, with regard to the professors, quite frankly, I asked them about their own evaluation. I did not test them. They basically all said they were between B2 and C2. Quite frankly, I think that would be the case because most of them had studied at a postgraduate level in an English-speaking country, okay? I do go back to the very old Commons distinction between basic interpersonal skills and then the cognitive academic language proficiency skills. What they did say is that they felt they were very, very advanced in speaking everyday language, but did have some difficulties with the more academic use because still quite a few of them had their papers corrected by so-called native speakers when they're published. But overall speaking, they were quite assured, okay? Again, they make differences when it comes to students. They will accept a lot of variety, different and great tolerances towards the varieties of English that the students bring to the classroom in the classroom for oral work. When it comes to writing, you will see that is not the case, okay? With regard to writing, it is they must write in an American English way or a UK English way. And comprehensibility no longer is a criterion. It's all about correctness, even if they do not know what exactly the correctness is. So, and almost all attention goes to orthography and grammar. There is some, as I said, some tolerance towards a lexical variety, okay? Like the students, they had very little understanding of what international English was about. The main thing I want to finish on, and I think this is something that we struggle with as language teachers much more, is that in effect, what these teachers had almost no understanding of were the cultural norms in terms of writing practices. What it meant is that, I don't have to explain this to you, so they were very unliberal in terms of written English. It had to be like British English or it had to be like an American English. However, if you have studied in an English-speaking country, you know that the structure of an essay is very linear. You have to have a very clear beginning, main point, and so on. So, typical discourse patterns that are much more prevalent, for example, in Germany, or in German academic discourse, or in French academic discourse, let alone in Indian English discourse, they were completely unaware of that. So if you had a perfect English language essay, but was written in a culturally German tradition, and it was double marked by an American English speaker who commented that this was not an essay that was acceptable in English, there were then misunderstandings between the two. So I don't have any answers in terms of that kind of issue. But what I do believe that we do not seem to be taking into account, and I must say I felt that was slightly missing from this colloquium too, we seem to be focusing on grammaticality or lexical or phonology, but quite frankly, what was never touched upon was actually discourse patterns or issues around politeness strategies, which in fact caused for many of the students many difficulties. So on that really negative note, I finish, and then I have, before you can ask me questions, you can tell me why I showed you, other than to keep active, the Evian ad. It certainly, well, this is what I asked. I teach a course, English, Global English, and this was to a group of French Canadian and French speakers from France. And I asked them to identify for me a typical symbol of Frenchness. And this is what they chose. Now, the interesting thing you will see is that this has been filmed in France. If you noted, I won't put it again, is they show where the bus is going. So it is set in France. It is the quintessential French, well, I'm sorry for the other ones, Baudouin and so on, but it is seen to be the quintessential French still water, and yet the entire thing is English. But this was the view that came from the French students in the class. So I thought that was a really interesting way in which global English was perceived by French speakers.
So thank you very much for your very interesting talk, which might interest us to well discuss it. Yes, please. First question.
I would just like to ask regarding the linguistic capital demand. So you are a dean also, so do you have any kind of open policy? How do you cope with the demand of professors, linguistic capital? For example, will you hire an Indian origin with a strong accent but quite a competent professor of English over there?
Yeah. Can I say that here there is quite a substantial difference between being based in an English-speaking country and a non-English-speaking country. The tolerance and the acceptability of different varieties of English in lecturers is much higher in Anglophone countries than it is not. So if you are an Indian speaker and you come and teach, well, there are of course, differences, but overall speaking, that would not be seen as problematic. That would not be seen as problematic. To go one step further, in the course that I teach, which is Issues in Global Englishes, I think I've said it before, I think I have 2 L1 speakers of English. The others are Singaporean, Korean, and so on. So my own feeling is how am I going to correct their work? Will I stick to what is called a British English norm? And I decided not to do that. But it must say it caused me a lot of work because I needed to try and work out, in some cases, why did this person say it in this way? And then I understood it was an argumentation that had come from another language, but it made sense, so it was acceptable. But I don't know 100%, but I think there is a slightly greater tolerance, yeah.
Yes, please.
To illustrate your point about last, our former colleague Philip Riley once did a study showing that actually the students in the English cafes, if they wrote respecting the Anglophone structure of the essay, they had lower grades than when they used the French structure.
Yeah.
So the point was that you had to use the French structure with English words, and if you actually wrote a proper English essay, then you would have a lower grade.
Yeah. But it's an interesting question, isn't it? If we move towards English as lingua franca, should we penalize students for using their cultural discourse patterns within the instrument of another language or not. I mean, you know, I don't have the answer for it. I've chosen to recognize different cultural patterns, but I'm only one person, you know.
In this case, it's actually if you use the English structure that you are...
Yeah, exactly, that you're penalized, yeah.
Do you have any more questions?
I think it depends on what we're training the students for, because whatever skills we're giving them has to have some value on the market, and that's what we were hearing these students say. So you have to make a distinction between the descriptive of what language they're using, what is their discourse, and the normative of what is the norm that they're required, that we have to hold them to in order to have these skills that have marketable value. And maybe I've just been around with this too many years, but I remember years ago hearing the linguist, a talk by the linguist William Labov at Teachers College, Columbia University, when I was a graduate student, and he was talking about a reader of Black English. And it was very popular in the U.S. at that time that we should teach African American students to read in Black English. This was really their language. And an African American woman got up in the audience and was really angry. And she said, no. She said, that's not the way we want our children to learn English. Is they're going to go out and they're going to be held against a standard norm. So I think maybe English is very good, I think in a descriptive way, whatever people are using it for interpersonal communication. And it also has a political aspect to it that becomes more appealing because we're detaching it from the political and historical and military economic baggage of the UK and the US. But we do have a responsibility to give whomever our clients are the skills that they really need, that they're really trained for.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. So I think it's a question that's being raised. The issue is indeed what do we use it for? I think the reaction that has come from people like Philipson and so on is if you continue to put more value on strict norms of American English or British English, and any other form would be seen as not as valuable, then we'll never get away from linguistic imperialism. That's a political argument he's putting forward. I'm putting that forward. I'm not saying I believe in that one, but that is one of the things. But ultimately, it is about what people consider to be linguistic capital, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
But this is a mere repetition of the old question of whether Esperanto is an egalitarian language or not. And believe me, it isn't. So the question has been settled a long time ago.
But it's not
this is
settled.
What I said
That's
this
why
morning.
we're still talking about it.
You should be going for acceptability, I think.
Yeah.
And this is, I think you are actually, but there's no fraud between the two of us.
No.
But, this other thing is, to me, like a repetition of old-time ideas out of the blue, really, political ideas.
Well, as you said, it's the same thing, but we keep doing it. The language might change, but we keep doing it as such. But I don't think we can get away from an increased utilitarian approach to why we need language, and therefore it probably slightly is so in Europe, but especially, if I may just give the last example, is I work in an area where they teach 49 different languages. We don't have any students doing Zulu anymore, not because they're not interested, but they're not going to pay £36,000 for 3 years of Zulu, when quite frankly, if you did something else. So unfortunately, that's an argument that we are being pushed more and more into about the instrumentality. Yeah. Anyway.
Okay, thank you very much for your very interesting talk. And we're going to have a coffee break now.